Before we get into today's build, I just wanted to quickly apologize for how late this video is. It was supposed to be out several weeks ago now, but I got very sick and, well, here we are. Anyways, let's talk about the build. Today I'm going to be showing off a hybrid build for Choir of One. Quick disclaimer, remember, Choir of One itself is not getting a damage nerf in Episode 2. Only its interaction with Divinity and its cage specifically are getting a nerf. And if you watched any of my Choir vs. Raid boss videos, you've seen that this thing does not need a div cage to melt bosses whatsoever. Moving on, initially, when this exotic came out, the main appeal was, and for the most part still is, the nutty damage when you get to using the hipfire mode, which is fair, it absolutely melts bosses, but what if you weren't in a raid and there was more enemy waves to just go through? What if you wanted to have the best of both worlds where you can be both a support player for your team, but also still put up respectable or top tier DPS? Well, Choir of One also has an ADS mode, the standard method for auto rifles, so you're able to alternate between chunking down yellow bar enemies and then switching to the ADS mode to crit enemies and conserve some ammo. Now granted, the ADS mode is a bit sluggish in that it doesn't fire quite as fast as a traditional auto rifle, but that's okay because we're going to pair it with one of the best abilities to clear entire waves in all of Destiny, Night Stalker Hunters with Tether. Thanks to Tether's mechanic of not only debuffing all enemies by 30%, but also spreading splash damage onto all the targets when you hit anything, this pairs very well with Choir of One. But we're not stopping there, we're also including our exotic choice, in this case, Falcon's Hauberk, which will let us take advantage of the Tether explosions one step further, and then spread volatile rounds onto every enemy. Triggering volatile rounds with this build is very simple. The easiest method to do this is just to activate your dodge ability, which will then make you invisible, and then you just pick any enemy to shoot, and bam, you have volatile rounds active. And if this is happening with a tether out, it'll just continue to spread and stack explosions. And that's not the only method to do this, though. You can also trigger volatile rounds with any of your abilities as well, including your tether. This is partially thanks to one of our aspects, Status Executioner, which upon defeating a weakened or volatile target grants you invisibility, and keep in mind, every single time that you go invisible and then hit an enemy, volatile rounds will proc. This loop essentially makes it so that once you get your initial volatile active, you will continuously trigger your abilities non-stop, and every time you get a kill, whether it's your abilities or your weapons, you will go invisible. Though I will note there is a tiny, small cooldown between invisibility triggers where you have to wait a second or two before being able to go invisible again, but this rarely comes up, and honestly, you probably won't even notice. So in simple terms, you utilize these loops to trap your enemy, debuffing them and blinding them, while also making them explode with Choir of One. And should you run into an enemy that is a higher rank, such as a yellow bar or a champion, you can then use the hipfire mode of Choir of One to nuke that enemy straight into orbit. And if that enemy was surrounded with a tether and a chain of other enemies, you probably nuked everything else around it too. Next, I'll go into full detail for the fragments and aspects, but I wanted to give a brief mention to a backup weapon to use for this build, if you happen to have it anyway. And that is going to be Falcon's best friend in the heavy slot, Retrofit Escapade. It's a 900 RPM void machine gun that can roll 4 times the charm and target lock, combining the best ammo refund perk in the game with the second best damage perk in the game. Retrofit does the same job as Choir would in terms of ad clear, except in the heavy slot, and you have a bit more ammo to blow through as well. It also, of course, gets ammo out of thin air thanks to 4 times, and should you run into some yellow bar enemies and utilize this combo of 4 times and target lock, not only will you melt the enemy, but this will also allow you to build a metric epton of super energy thanks to how super meter filling works in Destiny now. Alright, on to the character screen. So as you can see, we're on Night Stalker Hunter. This is a bit better than Prismatic just because Void Night Stalker, rather than Prismatic Tether, has some capabilities that Prismatic just doesn't have. But we'll get to Prismatic in a second anyway. So let's just talk about this. First, we have Shadow Shot Deadfall Tether. This is just the by far best version of Tether. This is just an anchor that'll suck up all the enemies into one vortex, and you can just kill them. The Tether also is on the ground for much longer, rather than a Quiver, where you have to fire it 3 times, and it also doesn't have an anchor on the ground, and it runs out much quicker. So just go with Deadfall. It's much better. Jump doesn't matter, whatever you want. Dodge doesn't matter, whatever you want. Although I will say I prefer to have reload dodge on, just because if I'm using Retrofit or Choir, I can just do reload dodge, bam, I have full ammo again, and that helps me kill either a yellow bar that's chunky or just enemies that have still walked into the vortex. Jump doesn't matter, like I mentioned. Then we have Snare Bomb for not only weakening enemies, but you could also use this as a version to smoke yourself to make yourself invis and then start your loop all over again. For Grenade, I have Vortex Grenade. I just think it's the best balanced overall grenade on Void. That's just me personally. For aspects, we have Vanishing Step, which allows you to go invisible when you dodge. So as I mentioned earlier, you dodge, you go invis, you shoot something, bam, volatile rounds active, go crazy. And then the other one is Stylish Executioner that I mentioned earlier. When defeating a weakened, suppressed, or volatile target, grants you invis, and then you go crazy. As for the fragments, first up is Echo of Starvation. Picking up a Void Breach or an Aura of Power grants you Devour. So, when you're going to be in your loops, every single time that you get a kill, you're going to proc Devour. So no matter what, as long as you don't get one-shot by a boss, you will continuously get healed as you're killing enemies inside of your tether, or just spamming your LMG or Acquire. After that is Echo of Undermining. Your Void Grenades weaken targets. So you're going to weaken a target, then kill it either with a grenade or a weapon, and then you will go invisible to start your chain. After that, we have Echo of Persistence. Void buffs applied to you, in this case, Invisibility and Devour, have an increased duration, so just the uptime of Devour and Invis is longer. That's good. And then last, we have Echo of Reprisal. Final blows when surrounded by commands grant you super energy. So, you may have noticed I mentioned only Falcons and not Orpheus Rigs. While Orpheus Rigs is a great exotic, in this particular case, we don't need it, because when using this fragment and just chaining enemies together with one tether, and you being just near them, you will get a ton of super energy back. And then, as I mentioned, if you're spamming Retrofit at an enemy, you will also get a ton of energy from that, and you will very quickly get your super back. This also doesn't include having teammates also making orbs for you. Now let's go over some mods that I think should be necessary for this build, or you should have on just to optimize more. First, in your helmet slot, I'd recommend running Special Ammo Finder for your Choir, and then having Dynamo and Void Siphon. Void Siphon's obvious to make the orbs for your build to go crazy with Devour, and then Dynamo is anytime that you dodge, and you'll be doing that a lot with this build, you can just build super energy from Dynamo as long as you dodged somewhat near an enemy. So it's just free super energy cooldown for basically nothing, right? That's pretty good to have on your helmet as well. Moving on to gloves, I have Firepower and Bolstering Detonation. Firepower will just make you an extra orb if you kill something with your grenade, which is very possible. And then Bolstering Detonation will give you class ability energy every time that you do use your grenade. So it's just getting your dodge back faster to go invis again, and then activate Volatile. In your chest, you just have Resist as usual, nothing crazy. Boots, you also have Surges, Void Surges in this case, also pretty standard. And then finally, in your class item, you have one copy of Bomber, one copy of Reaper for dodging and then getting a kill and making an orb of power for your loop. And then finally, Powerful Attraction. Since you're going to be dodging all the time non-stop, this way, if you create orbs of power but you're not necessarily right next to them, you just use Powerful Attraction when you dodge, and then it'll suck up the orbs and then give you your super energy quickly, just like that, and hopefully that gives you your tether back. Last thing I want to note for this build anyway, for Choir, you're probably wondering, hey Sneak, which version do you want to go with? Which catalyst do you want to use? Me personally, I think Subsistence is the best case in this scenario. You just have to defeat targets to partially reload your magazine, and you'll be doing that all the time. Now, I do think Onslaught is also still pretty good to go with. I wouldn't blame you if you want to go Onslaught just for the higher rate of fire, especially when you're using the ADS mode. However, I will say I'm not a fan of destabilizing rounds, and I think you should just stay away from that in general, because you already have all of your capabilities in front of you with what I just mentioned previously. So, Onslaught or Subsistence, go with one of those. Now lastly, there is a third hybrid option, and this option is just straight up DPS and nothing else. You're trying to crank out as much damage as possible, be the highest damage on your team, at one phase of boss, etc. This takes us from Void Hunter onto Prismatic that I mentioned earlier. Now, we're going to be rocking Celestial Nighthawk Golden Gun instead of Falcon's Tether. Our weapon is not going to change. It's still going to be Choir 1 as our main weapon for DPS, because again, it shreds. But our heavy is going to get swapped out from Retrofit to Edge Transit, thanks to having MES Bait and Switch on it. Now, mainly, you're going to use Choir, but if you happen to run out of Choir ammo, let's say you're doing the dungeon on contest mode day 1, you're going to use all your Choir ammo most likely on a boss, but you'll still be in the damage phase. That's where your heavy comes in with Edge Transit as your backup. Now your mods are going to stay exactly the same, but I'll briefly go over what the aspects and fragments are now since you're on Prismatic. I'll put the fragments up on screen here and I'll get to them in a second. But in terms of abilities and aspects, you have number 1, Melee, Smoke Bomb. Same reason as before, it's a weaken effect. Number 2, your grenade is now Dust Field for a Darkness debuff effect. I'll get to that in a second why I chose that. For aspects, you have Winter Shroud, same thing as Dust Field, a Darkness debuff effect. And then for the last aspect, you can pick whatever you want based on your personal preference. You could go with Ascension to build light energy if you'd like, or you could stick with Stylish if you want to go Invis every once in a while. Now, as for the fragments, this first fragment is why you have Winter Shroud and Dust Field partially on. and that is because Arc, Solar, and Void abilities do increased damage to targets afflicted with a Darkness debuff. So as soon as you throw a Dust Field onto a boss, that is a Darkness debuff, and your Celestial Nighthawk Golden Gun is Solar, so it'll do more damage just based off of that alone, not counting other debuffs. Number 2 is going to be Facet of Protection. While you're surrounded by combatants, you are more resilient or resistant to incoming damage, and while you're Transcendent, this effect is increased. So you're just getting free extra DR in content where there's a lot of ads. Number 3 is Facet of Command. This is the other reason why you use Stasis abilities. Thanks to Facet of Command, when you throw a Dust Field and the boss will eventually freeze, or if you throw your Prismatic Grenade and the same thing happens, they'll shatter instantly, but it'll still activate this fragment where your weapons will be reloaded for free. This you may have already seen a million times through Still Hunt DPS videos, but this also applies here as well. You just throw a Prismatic Grenade, keep shooting your Choir of 1, and eventually you'll get a free reload instead of having to manually reload with Choir. Number 4 is Facet of Dawn. Powered melee hits against targets make you radiant. So, you're going to throw your smoke, you're going to weaken an enemy, now they'll be taking more damage. By you throwing your smoke, you also gave yourself radiant, so you'll be doing more outgoing damage. So it's a double effect just to get more damage out. Number 5 is Facet of Grace. This is here just in the event that you want to build your prismatic meter that much faster. Defeating targets with kinetic weapons grants you bonus transcendent energy. Pretty straightforward. And the last one is going to be Facet of Purpose. Picking up an Orb of Power grants you either Amplified Restoration, Frost Armor, Whirlwind Mail, or an Overshield based on the damage type of your super. In this case, you will be getting Restoration every time that you pick up an Orb, so it's extra healing just in case. And that is my Choir of 1 Hunter hybrid builds. I'll have the dim links for these builds down in the description below. If the link is broken or whatever, just yell at me in the comments and I'll change it when I can. In the meantime, hopefully this maybe helps you get that Day 1 contest emblem in the dungeon and get Icebreaker on top of that. If you enjoyed the build or the video, please consider subscribing today. It does help the channel grow and is much appreciated on the way to 50k. And if you want to go the extra mile, you can leave a like and or a comment below as well. If you don't know what to leave as a comment, you can leave Choir of 1 as the comment. Thanks for watching. Catch you next time.